Well, I'm joined via webcam by Shashank Joshi, who is the defence editor of The Economist. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Do you think that what has happened here at Gatwick does expose a vulnerability of a huge airport like this? Shouldn't it have had measures in place to stop these drones?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a huge amount of attention has gone into threats from drones, but most of that attention has been in situations where there is a risk of loss of life. So that has been on big sporting events, the risk of terrorist attacks, the risk of assassinations. Of course, we saw an attempted assassination against Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro a few months ago. And in those scenarios, in those situations, the options for taking down the drone by jamming or kinetic attack, whether that's nets or bullets or some other kind of measure where there are risks associated with that, are palatable. It's acceptable to shoot down a drone if the risk is immediate loss of life. In the case of disruption, I think many of the capabilities will have been designed either for military purposes, as we've now seen in the past couple of days, for protecting air bases in very contested, very dangerous environments, or in situations of perhaps mass casualty terrorist attacks. So I think there will be options available, but using some of those options will be a slightly more sort of difficult political and policy challenge because of the context of Gatwick, the fact that the downside is disruption to flights rather than loss of life. So I think the challenge will be now focusing on how do we also protect these big vulnerable sites where the risk is not just terrorism, but also episodes like this.
What about tracking down the people who appear to be deliberately flying a drone or drones and causing this disruption? Is there really no way of tracking or tracing where the drones are being operated from?
Well, if they're operated by radio, then radio direction finding and locating the source of the transmissions is a possibility. That's a possibility. But I think what I would also say is it's possible for the operators to be moving around, for example, in a van or a car, and that can make the job of locating them extremely difficult. It's also worth noting many sophisticated drones, or even not very sophisticated drones, can also be pre-programmed to fly particular waypoints. They can fly pre-programmed routes in a particular way, and in that sense, they don't necessarily need to have continuous direction and signals sent from an operator that would give the location away. That may also be complicating the job of those doing this task. Having said that, now that the army are involved with what I would imagine is very considerable electronic warfare capability, perhaps other agencies are involved in this, I'd be very surprised if the direction finding, if locating the origin is not something that now could be done in a more timely way. If that's not the case, there must be some other explanation that I think is even more complicated than that.
There are lots of theories about who may be behind this. One suggestion is that it was some kind of environmental protest. People are questioning whether it could be some kind of Russian-inspired attempt to disrupt things, or simply a lone wolf, as they're known. What do you think is the most likely explanation?
I think we simply can't say until we have more evidence of the device that was used, the sophistication of the signals, and all of those things. I think what's very clear is if they're able to evade the level of capabilities we have now seen deployed by the full spectrum of the British state, we're talking about a reasonably sophisticated operator. The environmental theory, of course, is really only based on past closure of runways and past targeting of airports. I don't think it's based on anything more than that. I think state-level capabilities are fairly unlikely. Of course, states like Russia may have an interest in learning about the extent and sophistication of anti-drone capabilities, but I don't think that they would go in for an operation like this with the enormous political risk, particularly after Skripal, particularly after the enormous diplomatic pressure on Russia that we would see. So I think a state is a fairly implausible explanation, although, of course, all options, all considerations will be taken. So I think the most likely explanation would be an individual or a small group with a perhaps political motivation or an ideological motivation, clearly looking at disruption over a prolonged period rather than any kind of act of terrorism, act of vandalism or act of violence.
Clearly there is going to be big pressure on the authorities now to get better systems in place to prevent a repeat of this. Would one idea be this idea of increasing the exclusion zone around an airport? At the moment, you're not allowed to fly a drone within 1 kilometre of an airport. Many other countries have much bigger areas where you can't fly a drone. Is that something that the government should be looking at?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is the case for an exclusion zone and the enlargement of the exclusion zone may be strong, but that would not necessarily stop people from circumventing that. So you have to ask the fundamental question is, how do you enforce the exclusion zone? Not necessarily what the exclusion zone is. You can have detection technology, you can have monitoring technology, but of course, simply jamming GPS signals around a continuously functioning airport is not only legally complicated, but of course it's also operationally complicated given the number of aircraft and systems using GPS and other signals around an airport. So I think the question I would say is, don't fixate on the exclusion zone or the rules. Ask the question of, I think, how we enforce the rules that will inevitably be tightened up in the months ahead.
Shashank Joshi, thank you very much indeed for joining us this